Sophia Matthews walked into that church with flowers in her hands and love in her heart, and walked out with neither. She stood at the back of that chapel, bouquet trembling, watching her own twin sister step to the altar in her place. Watching Ethan Clark reach for Victoria's hand like she had never existed at all. Some betrayals break you clean. This one shattered her slow, piece by piece, on the hottest summer morning Virginia had ever seen. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with everything, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The dress had taken her mother 3 months to sew. Ivory cotton, hand-stitched at the collar, fitted through the waist the way Sophia had always dreamed a wedding dress ought to fit. She'd stood still for every pinning, every measuring. Every quiet moment her mother had pressed a palm to her cheek and whispered that she was going to be just fine, that Ethan Clark was a good man, that this was the beginning of something real. She believed every word of it. She believed it right up until she heard the organ playing inside First Methodist Church of Harrowfield, Virginia, and knew, deep in the pit of her stomach, that it was already too late. Sophia had been standing in the back hallway for 23 minutes. She'd counted every one of them. Mrs. Alcott was supposed to come and give her the signal, a knock on the door, 2 short taps, same as they'd rehearsed. It never came. What came instead was the low, rolling sound of music drifting under the door, and then the unmistakable lift of voices, and then, worst of all, laughter. She pushed the door open herself. The pews were full. Every family in Harrowfield had turned out in their Sunday best. The Holloways, the Brents, the Carver family with their 7 children, all wedged into 2 rows. Old Reverend Hayes stood at the head of the aisle in his white collar, his prayer book open in his hands. And at the altar, in a pale blue dress Sophia had never seen before, stood Victoria Matthews, her sister, her twin. And beside Victoria, holding both her hands like they were the most precious things he'd ever touched, stood Ethan Clark. Sophia didn't scream. She didn't cry out. She just stood there in the doorway in her ivory dress, her bouquet hanging loose in one hand, and watched Ethan lean forward and press his lips to Victoria's cheek while the crowd erupted in applause. It was Mrs. Hargrove who noticed her first. The old woman turned in her pew, saw Sophia standing there, and her mouth dropped open. Then her elbow found Mr. Hargrove's ribs. Then he turned. Then the Carver children twisted around, and one by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, the entire congregation shifted to stare at the bride, who was not standing at the altar. The music stopped. Reverend Hayes looked up from his prayer book. Ethan Clark turned around. Sophia had imagined, in the months leading up to this day, what it might feel like to lock eyes with Ethan across a crowded room. She had imagined warmth, certainty, the quiet, unspoken language of 2 people who had chosen each other. What she saw instead was panic. His face went pale. His hands dropped Victoria's. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Just the shape of her name, silent and useless, like a prayer he'd forgotten the words to. Victoria turned too, and her expression was something Sophia had never seen on her sister's face before. Not guilt, not sorrow. Something colder than either of those things. Something that looked almost like relief. Sophia. Her mother's voice came from the left side of the aisle, thin and strained. Sophia, I tried to reach you this morning. We sent a rider to the inn, but they said you'd already... You knew. Sophia's voice came out steady. She didn't know how. You knew, Mama. Her mother pressed a handkerchief to her mouth and said nothing. The silence in that church was the loudest thing Sophia had ever heard. She looked at Ethan. She made herself hold his gaze, because she decided in that moment that she would not be the one to look away. Not today. Not after everything. "Ethan," she said, "did you mean to tell me yourself? Or were you hoping I simply wouldn't come?" He took a step toward her. "Sophia, it ain't what you're thinking. I never meant for it to happen this way. I swear to God, I never—" "You never what?" Her voice didn't shake. She was almost proud of it. "You never meant to stand at the altar with my sister in my dress? You never meant to let me put on my mother's stitching and walk to a church where you'd already made your choice without me?" "I love her." The words came out of him like a confession, broken, ashamed, like he thought saying it plainly might somehow hurt less. "Sophia, I'm sorry. I love Victoria. I've loved her for a long time, and I didn't know how to tell you." "Long time," she repeated. "Since last winter." She did the arithmetic without meaning to. Last winter was 6 months ago. 6 months of Ethan Clark sitting across from her at her family's dinner table. 6 months of him walking her to Sunday services and tipping his hat at her door and telling her she looked lovely in the evening light. 6 months of her sister standing right beside her, smiling, saying nothing. She turned to Victoria then, her twin, her identical face, her identical eyes, wearing a dress the color of a summer sky, looked back at her without flinching. "Say something," Sophia said. "Victoria, look at me and say something." "There ain't much to say." Victoria's chin lifted just slightly. "What's done is done." Something snapped inside Sophia Matthews in that moment. Not loudly, not with the kind of violence she might have expected, just quietly. Like a thread pulled too tight for too long, finally giving way without any fanfare at all. She set her bouquet down on the nearest pew. She smoothed the front of her ivory dress with both hands. She lifted her head. "Then I suppose you're right," she said. "What's done is done." She turned and walked back out the door. The heat hit her the moment she stepped outside. Thick, heavy Virginia summer air that pressed against her skin and made the world swim at the edges. She walked down the church steps without looking back. She could hear the low roar of voices starting up behind her, the hum of the congregation finding its footing again, the whispers multiplying like fire in dry grass. She kept walking. She made it as far as the old oak tree at the edge of the churchyard before her legs gave out. She sat down against the trunk, with her ivory dress pooling around her in the dust, and pressed the back of her hand to her mouth. She would not cry here. She would not give Harrowfield that. She was still sitting there, still holding herself together by sheer force of will, when she heard boots on the gravel behind her. She didn't look up. She assumed it was her mother, or perhaps one of the Carver women, coming to offer useless consolation. "Miss Matthews." The voice was not her mother's. It was low, deliberate, the kind of voice that was used to being heard without having to raise itself. She looked up. The man standing at the edge of the churchyard was not from Harrowfield. She knew that immediately, the way you know a thing without being able to fully explain how. He was tall, built the way men who'd spent time outdoors were built, broad through the shoulders and unhurried in the way he held himself. He wore a dark coat despite the heat, and his hat was in his hands rather than on his head, which struck her as an oddly deliberate gesture of respect for a complete stranger. His eyes were gray, the kind of gray that wasn't soft, more like flint or a sky right before a storm decides what it's going to do. "I don't believe we've been introduced," Sophia said. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. She didn't apologize for it. "No, ma'am, we haven't." He inclined his head slightly. "Robert Pinson. I was a guest of Judge Alcott's party. Rode in from Richmond 2 days ago." "I see." She looked back down at her hands. "Well, Mr. Pinson, I appreciate the courtesy, but I am not particularly in need of company at the moment." "I reckon that's true," he said. He didn't leave. She glanced up at him again. "Was there something you wanted?" "I wanted to tell you," he said carefully, "that what happened in there was not your fault, and that the people in that town who whisper otherwise aren't worth the breath it takes to answer them." Sophia stared at him. She had expected sympathy, maybe. Pity, certainly. She had expected the particular brand of gentle condescension that people offered to women who'd been publicly embarrassed. The soft voices, the careful hands, the "We're so sorry, dear, what a terrible thing." She had not expected someone to simply say the true thing out loud and then stand there, waiting for her to decide what to do with it. "You don't know me," she said. "No, ma'am, and you don't know what happened in there." "I was standing at the back of that church," he said. "I know enough." A silence stretched between them. Somewhere inside the building, the organ had started up again. Slowly, tentatively, as though the musician wasn't certain the occasion still called for music. "They'll be talking about this for years," Sophia said. She wasn't speaking to him, exactly. More to the oak tree, to the summer air, to herself. "Every woman in Harrowfield will look at me different come Monday morning. Every family with a son of marrying age will close their door a little quieter when I walk past. The jilted girl. The one her own sister didn't think worth a warning." "Yes," Robert Pinson said. "Most likely." She looked at him sharply. Most people, when faced with a woman in pain, reached for reassurance, false comfort, the soothing lie. He just stood there, straight-backed and unhurried, telling her the truth. "You are a strange man, Mr. Pinson," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, barely. Not quite a smile. Something more guarded than that. "I've been told." She rose to her feet, brushing dust from her skirt with the automatic dignity of a woman who had been taught since childhood that posture was its own form of armor. She was taller than she'd seemed sitting down, nearly met his collarbone, which was more height than most men expected from her. "I should go home," she said. "Miss Matthews." His voice stopped her. Not urgently, just with the quiet certainty of a man who'd decided to say a thing and intended to say it. "I'll be in Harrowfield through the end of the week. I'd be glad of the chance to speak with you again, if you're willing." She turned back to look at him. His expression was unreadable. Not cold exactly, but guarded in a way that felt less like arrogance and more like caution. Like a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that showing your hand too early cost you more than it bought. "Why?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because you walked out of that church with your head up. And I reckon that says more about who you are than anything that happened inside it." Sophia Matthews stood in the dust of the Harrowfield churchyard in her mother's ivory dress, on the morning that was supposed to be the beginning of her life, and looked at Robert Pinson for a long moment. "Good day, Mr. Pinson," she said. She walked home, alone. The house was quiet when she got there. Her father was in his chair on the porch, hat over his face, pretending to be asleep in the way he always did when he didn't know what to say. The door to her room was open. Someone, her mother probably, had already laid out a plain day dress on the bed, as though the ivory gown might need to be surrendered before anything else could begin. She sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time. She thought about Ethan. Not with love. That had burned off somewhere between the church door and the oak tree, faster than she would have expected 6 months of courtship to allow. What she felt now was something colder and more precise. She thought about every conversation they'd had since last winter. Every time he'd been distracted when he should have been present. Every evening he'd arrived at her door a little late, a little distant. With some explanation she'd accepted without question, because she had trusted him. She had trusted them both. She heard her mother on the stairs. The particular rhythm of that step, the slight hesitation on the third board, and made herself breathe before the door opened. Her mother came in quietly. She sat beside Sophia on the bed without speaking for a long moment. Then she took Sophia's hands in hers, and Sophia could feel how much she was trembling. "I only found out yesterday," her mother said. "Sophia, I want you to know that. I only found out yesterday evening, and I sent a rider to the inn first thing this morning. And when they said you'd already left, I thought perhaps Ethan had found a way to reach you himself, and He didn't." Sophia's voice was quiet, flat. Nobody did. Her mother closed her eyes. "I am so sorry. Did Victoria tell you herself?" A pause. "She came to me last night. She said she and Ethan that they had developed feelings for each other over the winter, and that she was sorry, but that she loved him, and that she hoped I would understand." "And what did you say?" Another pause, longer than the first. "I told her she ought to have come to you sooner, that this was not the way. But you didn't stop it." Her mother said nothing. Sophia pulled her hands back gently. "It's all right, Mama. I ain't angry at you." She looked out the window. "I just need to think." "Of course." Her mother rose. At the door she paused. "There were some folk at the church who were talking about Robert Pinson. Do you know who he is?" Sophia thought of gray eyes, the hat held in steady hands, the simple, unhurried truth of him. "He introduced himself," she said carefully. "I don't know more than that." Her mother's voice dropped lower, the way it did when she was imparting something she considered significant. "He owns the Pinson lands, Sophia. Nearly 4,000 acres, stretching from the ridge all the way to the river county line. Judge Alcott's been courting his business for 2 years. They say he's the wealthiest man in 3 counties, and the most difficult." A beat. "They call him the Duke. Not his title, mind you. It's what folks call him, on account of how he carries himself. Like he answers to nobody." Sophia was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" Her mother hesitated. "Because Mrs. Alcott told me, just before I left the church, that he'd asked after you. By name." The room was very still. "He asked," her mother continued, "whether you were spoken for." Sophia Matthews sat in her plain room in her mother's ivory dress and let that land in the silence between them. Ethan Clark had stood at an altar and chosen Victoria, and Robert Pinson, a man she had spoken 15 words to, had asked whether she was spoken for. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't know what she wanted it to mean. All she knew was that the morning had taken everything she thought was settled and turned it to smoke. And somewhere on the far side of that smoke, something else was beginning to take shape. She didn't know yet whether to be afraid of it or not. "Thank you, Mama," she said softly. "I'd like to be alone now." Her mother nodded and closed the door behind her. Sophia Matthews sat very still in the summer quiet, and for the first time since she'd walked out of that church, she let herself feel the full weight of everything she'd lost. And then, slowly, like a woman learning to stand on unfamiliar ground, she let herself wonder what might be coming next. 3 days passed before Robert Pinson came to her door. Sophia had spent those 3 days doing what women in Harrowfield did when their lives fell apart. She kept her hands busy and her face neutral, and she did not go into town. She beat the rugs. She helped her mother put up preserves. She read the same page of the same book 17 times without absorbing a single word. and every morning she told herself she was not thinking about gray eyes or a hat held in steady hands. And every evening she caught herself lying. The town had not been quiet about what happened. Word traveled fast in Harrowfield. By Sunday evening, Mrs. Carver had apparently told Mrs. Holbrook, who had told the Brent sisters, who had told everybody else. And by Monday, the shape of the story had shifted in the way stories always do when they pass through enough mouths. The details stayed mostly true, but the meaning changed. So that by Tuesday, what people were mostly saying was not that Ethan Clark had behaved shamefully, or that Victoria Matthews had betrayed her own blood, but that poor Sophia had always been the quieter one, the plainer one in spirit. And perhaps it wasn't such a surprise that Ethan had chosen the livelier sister in the end. Sophia heard this from her cousin Nell, who came by Tuesday afternoon with a jar of honey and the specific kind of sympathy that is mostly curiosity in a charitable dress. "People don't mean to be cruel," Nell said, settling herself at the kitchen table. "They just, well, you know how folks talk." "I know how folks talk," Sophia agreed. "And of course Ethan's family is saying it was inevitable, that they'd known about him and Victoria for months." "Nell," her cousin stopped. "I appreciate you coming," Sophia said. "I do. But if the next words out of your mouth are anything other than what you'd once said to you in my position, I'd rather we talk about something else entirely." Nell had the grace to look embarrassed. She stayed for another hour and kept to safer subjects. And when she left, Sophia sat in the kitchen for a long time, listening to the particular silence of a house where everyone was trying very hard not to say the wrong thing. It was into that silence that the knock came, on Wednesday morning, just after 10. Her mother answered the door. Sophia heard the low voice before she heard the words, and she was already standing by the time her mother appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that managed to be both controlled and electric at once. "Mr. Pinson is here," her mother said. "He's asking to speak with you." Sophia smoothed her apron. "Tell him I'll be a moment." "Sophia, a moment, Mama." She took exactly that long. Long enough to be unhurried, not long enough to seem rattled, before she came to the front room. Robert Pinson stood by the door with his hat in his hands, same as he'd stood in the churchyard. He looked different in the daylight of an ordinary room. More real, somehow. Less like a figure at the edge of things. He was watching her with those gray eyes, patient and still, and he nodded when she came in. "Miss Matthews," he said. "Mr. Pinson." She did not offer him a chair. She hadn't decided yet whether this was a conversation that needed to be comfortable. "You said you'd be in Harrowfield through the end of the week." "I did." "It's Wednesday." "Yes, ma'am, it is." A beat of silence. He didn't seem troubled by it. "My mother tells me you asked after me at the church," Sophia said. "I'd rather hear from you directly what it is you wanted to ask." Something moved behind his eyes, a flicker of what might have been respect, or might have been reassessment. He was quiet for just a moment, the way a man is quiet when he'd prepared several approaches and is deciding in real time which one to use. "All right," he said. "Then I'll say it plainly. I came to ask whether you'd consider speaking with me about a proposal." The word landed hard in the room. "A proposal," Sophia repeated. "A business arrangement, of sorts." He paused. "I want to be honest with you about what I mean by that, which is why I wanted to speak with you directly rather than go through your father." She looked at him steadily. "You have about 60 seconds of my good faith left, Mr. Pinson. I'd use them carefully." The corner of his mouth moved, that same barely there expression she'd seen in the churchyard. "I'm 34 years old," he said. "I own 4,000 acres of land and a house that runs better than most operations in the state of Virginia. I have no wife. I have certain reasons why I need one. Not for sentiment, not for society's comfort. For practical purposes that I'll explain if you're willing to hear them. He met her eyes. I want to marry you, Miss Matthews. Not as a second choice, as a deliberate one. The room was very, very quiet. Sophia could hear her own breathing. She could hear her mother somewhere at the back of the house. The particular stillness of someone who has stopped moving in order to listen. "You don't know me," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You said so yourself in the churchyard." "I know enough." "You've said that before. I'd like to know what it means." He shifted slightly. The first time she'd seen him move in a way that wasn't entirely controlled. "I know that when your world came apart in front of every person in your town, you didn't collapse, and you didn't scream, and you didn't beg. You put your flowers down, and you walked out with your back straight." He paused. "I need a woman who does that. Not a woman who performs it. A woman who actually does it." Sophia stared at him for a long moment. "Sit down, Mr. Pinson," she said. He sat. She sat across from him, folded her hands in her lap, and made a decision she could feel the weight of, even as she was making it. The decision to stop being polite and start being honest. "I want to understand something," she said. "You rode into Harrowfield 2 days before a wedding you were attending as a guest. You watched a stranger get humiliated in a church, and your response to that was to ask Judge Alcott whether she was spoken for." She looked at him directly. "Why?" Robert Pinson was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man stalling, the silence of a man choosing exactness. "Because I've been looking for a reason to make this decision for 2 years, he said. "And I'd been telling myself I hadn't found the right one. And then I watched you stand in that doorway, and I thought, there she is." The honesty of it hit her somewhere she wasn't prepared for. She made herself stay practical. "You said you have reasons. Explain them to me." He nodded once, businesslike, like a man who appreciated being taken at his word. "My father died 14 months ago. He left the Pinson estate in better shape than it deserved to be, given the debts he'd run up in his last years without telling any of us. I've spent the past year clearing those debts quietly. There are 2 men in Richmond, Harlan Cole and a business partner of his, who loaned my father money and have been circling the property ever since, waiting for a moment of weakness to call those loans in at terms that would force a sale." He paused. "Virginia land law gives them limited options as long as the estate remains in the hands of a Pinson family unit. A married man with legal claim to the full property is harder to maneuver against than a bachelor with a contested estate." Sophia took that in. "So, you want to marry me to protect your land?" "Partly." "What's the other part?" He looked at her steadily. "My sister left 2 years ago. She was supposed to take over management of the household accounts. She was better at it than anyone I'd ever hired, and I trusted her completely. She ran off with a man from Georgia without so much as a letter left behind." His voice stayed even, but she could hear the thing underneath it, the controlled, careful quality of a wound that had been worked over until it stopped showing. "I don't say that to earn your sympathy. I say it so you understand that I have limited patience for betrayal, and limited interest in pretty words that don't match what a person actually does." The echo of it, his sister's desertion, her sister's, settled in the room between them like something they were both looking at without naming directly. "How much time do I have?" Sophia said. "To give you an answer?" "I leave Friday morning. I'd need your answer by Thursday evening." "That's 2 days." "Yes, ma'am." "You're asking me to decide in 2 days whether to marry a man I don't know and move to a property I've never seen, Because you need a legal buffer against land speculators, and you admired how I walked out of a church? When you say it like that, he said, it does sound thin. It doesn't just sound thin, Mr. Pinson. It is thin. I know it. He didn't flinch. I also know what your options are in Harrowfield right now. And I know what mine are. And I think we both know that two people who've had the same kind of year we've had might understand each other better than either of us would care to admit. That was the moment, the exact moment, when Sophia Matthews stopped seeing Robert Pinson as a stranger and started seeing him as something more complicated than that. She didn't show it. She had learned a long time ago not to show the moments that mattered most, until she'd had time to turn them over in her hands and understand what they meant. I'll think on it, she said. He rose. I'm staying at the Alcott House. You can send word there. I know where the Alcott House is. He nodded. At the door he paused, hat back in his hands, and said without turning fully around, For what it's worth, Miss Matthews, I wouldn't ask this of a woman I didn't believe could handle it. That's not nothing. He left without waiting for her to respond. Sophia sat in the front room for a long time after the door closed. Her mother appeared in the kitchen doorway with both hands wrapped around a tea cloth and an expression that was fighting a losing battle against itself. I heard, her mother said. I know you did. Sophia, don't. She shook her head. Not yet, Mama. Let me think. She thought for the rest of the morning. She thought through the afternoon, through supper, through the long evening while her father sat on the porch and her mother pretended to sew, and the house held its breath around her. She thought about Harrowfield and the way Mrs. Carver had looked at her in the churchyard. She thought about what Nell had said about the things people were saying, and about the Brent sisters' quiet satisfaction, and about the way a small town's mercy had a very short shelf life for a woman who'd been publicly discarded. She thought about 4,000 acres and a man who looked at her like she was a fact he'd already decided to build something on. She was still thinking when Victoria's letter arrived. It came just after dark, delivered by the youngest Alcott boy, who handed it over with the particular embarrassment of a child caught between adults doing things he didn't understand. Sophia took it, thanked him, and carried it to her room before opening it. Victoria's handwriting was neater than hers, had always been, which had been a small and petty source of irritation since childhood. Sophia, it began, I know you won't want to hear from me. I'm writing anyway because I think you deserve to hear me say, I'm sorry, even if sorry isn't near enough. I didn't plan for things to happen the way they did. I want you to know that. Sophia read it twice. Then she read the second paragraph, which began, Ethan and I are planning to be married properly next month, in Richmond, away from all this fuss. I hope that in time you'll be able to see that this was the right thing, even if it didn't feel that way. I hope you find happiness, Sophia. I truly do. She folded the letter once, carefully, along its original crease. I hope you find happiness. Written by the hand that had taken the happiness she'd already been building, piece by careful piece, for 6 months. She sat with that for a long moment, and then something inside her went very quiet and very clear. The way things do when you've been circling a decision for long enough that your heart finally catches up to what your mind already knows. She went to her father's desk. She found paper and pen. She wrote 8 words. I accept your proposal. I will explain the terms. And she folded it and sealed it and called down to the youngest Alcott boy, who was apparently still lingering at the garden gate in case there was a return errand. She gave him the note and watched him disappear into the dark. Then she went back to the front room, where her mother was still sitting with her pretend sewing, and she said, I'm going to marry Robert Pinson. Her mother's hands went still. Sophia, she said, very carefully, you don't love him. No, Sophia agreed. I don't. Then why? Because I ain't going to sit in this town and let them make a story out of what happened to me. Her voice was steady, cleaner than she expected it to be. Because I deserve more than what's left here for me now. And because... She paused, and when she spoke again, the honesty of it surprised even herself. Because he looked at me like I was worth something, Mama. Not out of pity, not out of obligation. He looked at me like I was worth the trouble of choosing. She heard her mother exhale, long and unsteady, the breath of a woman who knows her child is about to walk into something large and doesn't have the means to stop it. He's a hard man, her mother said softly. People say a great deal of things. Sophia sat beside her and took her hand. You raised me to judge for myself. Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then, Are you afraid? Sophia considered that honestly. She thought about the gray eyes and the straight-backed patience of him, and the way he told her the truth without dressing it up, and the way his voice had gone careful and controlled when he mentioned his sister. Like a man who'd learned to carry pain quietly because nobody had ever offered to help him set it down. A little, she admitted, but not of him. Her mother gripped her hand tighter. Then what? Of being wrong again, Sophia said simply. They sat together in the lamplit room for a long time after that. Two women with the particular silence between them that lives only between mothers and daughters, full of things said and unsaid, and understood without either. While outside, the Virginia summer pressed against the windows, and Harrowfield went on talking, the way small towns always do, and the world prepared itself, without ceremony or warning, to change. The reply came back within the hour. No letter, just the Alcott boy at the gate again, holding a single folded card on which Robert Pinson had written 4 words in a hand that was precise and unhesitating. Thursday evening, bring your father. Sophia read it twice, the same way she'd read Victoria's letter. Then she set it on the desk beside her mother's sewing basket and pressed her palm flat against the paper for just a moment, steadying herself, the way a woman does when she's standing at the beginning of something she can't yet see the end of. She lifted her hand. She stood straight. Tomorrow she would meet with Robert Pinson and tell him her terms. Tonight, she let herself feel the full weight of the choice she'd made and did not look away from it. Whatever came next, she had chosen it with her eyes open. And that, after everything, was more than she'd had this time last week. Her father didn't sleep that night. Sophia could hear him, the slow creak of his chair on the porch boards, the particular rhythm of a man turning something over in his mind that refused to settle. She lay in her room with her eyes open and let him have it. He'd earned the right to sit with it through the dark hours. She had told him over supper, quietly and without ceremony, and he had taken it the way her father took most hard things, silently, with his jaw set and his hands flat on the table, as though stillness were a form of control. He hadn't said no. He hadn't said yes. He'd said, I'll go with you Thursday evening, and that was all. Her mother had said enough for both of them. Thursday arrived the way summer days do in Virginia, heavy and certain. The heat settled in before most people were out of bed. Sophia dressed carefully, not in her best because she was not going to perform anything, but neatly, precisely, in the way she'd learned to carry herself when she needed the world to take her at full value rather than at whatever discount it had decided to apply. Her father came down at 8. He'd shaved. He'd put on his good coat. He didn't say a word about any of it, just poured his coffee and stood at the window. And Sophia loved him fiercely for the dignity of that, for the way he was going to walk into that meeting and stand beside her without making her feel like a burden or a problem to be solved. They went to the Alcott house at 5 o'clock. Judge Alcott had made himself scarce, which told Sophia everything she needed to know about how much Robert Pinson valued discretion. The parlor was empty except for the three of them, Robert standing when they entered, her father going still beside her in the way large, quiet men go still when they're measuring something. The two of them regarded each other for a long moment. Then her father said, "Mr. Pinson," and Robert said, "Mr. Matthews, thank you for coming. Wasn't going to let my daughter walk into this alone. I wouldn't have expected you to." Something passed between them. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of mutual recognition. Two men taking each other's measure and not entirely disliking what they found. Sophia sat down, folded her hands, and said, "I have conditions." Robert turned to her. He'd been expecting it. She could see that in the way he settled into the chair across from her, unhurried, attentive. "Let's hear them. I want it in writing that I retain the right to manage my own correspondence and maintain contact with my family without restriction. I want a household allowance in my own name, separate from whatever accounts you run the estate on. I want it understood that I am not a decoration, and I am not a housekeeper, and I will not be treated as either." She paused. "And I want the truth about Harlan Cole and his partner. All of it. Not the version you think is appropriate to share with a woman. All of it." Her father made a small sound beside her. Not disapproval. Something closer to surprise. The particular brand of it that fathers feel when their daughters turn out to be more than they knew. Robert looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then, "Agreed to the first three. On the fourth, what do you know about Cole?" "Less than I intend to," she said, "which is why it's a condition." He was quiet. She had the distinct sense that he was recalibrating, that the woman sitting across from him was somewhat different from what he'd drafted in his mind, and that he was deciding whether that was a problem or an advantage. "Cole and his partner, man named Preston Graves, loaned my father $38,000 over the course of 4 years, he said. My father was not a careful man in his later years. He was a proud man, which is its own kind of carelessness. He borrowed against the land rather than admit to anyone that the harvests had been bad and his investments had failed. He kept his voice level. I found out after he died. I've been paying it back steadily since. I have perhaps 6 months left before I've cleared the principal. But Cole has been buying up land along the River County line for 2 years, quietly, through intermediaries. And I believe he wants the Pinson acreage specifically. If I am unmarried, and the estate can be construed as contested in any way, Virginia law gives him a narrow but real opening to accelerate the terms. And a wife closes that opening, Sophia said. A wife with a signed deed of co-ownership closes it permanently. Her father straightened. You'd put her name on the deed. That was always part of the offer, Robert said. He looked at her father directly. I want to be clear, Mr. Matthews. I am not asking your daughter to be a temporary convenience. I am asking her to be my legal partner in a property matter that has significant consequences for both of our futures. The terms will protect her as much as they protect me. Her father was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Sophia. It's your choice, he said. Always has been. She looked at Robert. 6 months, she said, until the debt is cleared. In that 6 months, we establish the household. We are seen publicly as a married couple, and we settle the Cole situation. After that, we renegotiate whatever arrangement suits us both going forward. Robert held her gaze. Agreed. In writing. In writing, he said. Her father drew a breath. You'll treat her well. It wasn't a question. Robert understood it as the thing it was, a statement of expectation from a man who was handing over the most valuable thing he had. "I will," Robert said. And then, with the quiet deliberateness she was beginning to recognize as simply the way he spoke, "I have no interest in anything less." They were married 4 days later. No ceremony to speak of. Reverend Hayes, the judge's parlor, 2 witnesses, and a document that said Sophia Ann Matthews and Robert James Pinson were bound in the eyes of God and the Commonwealth of Virginia. Her mother cried quietly in the back corner. Her father shook Robert's hand for a long time without letting go, then pulled Sophia into his arms and held her the way he'd held her when she was small and the world was frightening. Like if he pressed hard enough, he could give her some of his own steadiness to take with her. "You write," he said against her hair. "Every week." "Every week," she promised. They left Harrowfield that afternoon. The Pinson estate was a full day's ride from town, north, through the ridge country, into land that grew quieter and wilder as they went. Sophia sat across from Robert in the carriage and spent the first 2 hours watching the landscape and saying very little. He spent them looking at papers from a leather satchel, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. No forced conversation. No performance of newlywed warmth that neither of them had earned yet. It was Robert who broke the silence first. "The housekeeper's name is Mrs. Galt," he said, without looking up from his papers. "She's been running the household for 11 years. She's efficient, she is not particularly warm, and she will form an opinion of you in the first 5 minutes that will take months to revise if it's the wrong one." How do I avoid the wrong one? Don't try to manage her. Don't defer to her either. Treat her like a professional, which is what she is, and she'll return the favor. He paused. She disapproved of my sister's way of doing things. She's been running the household alone since Eleanor left. She may find it adjusting to share the authority. Eleanor, his sister's name, said plainly, like he decided it didn't need to cost him anything to say it. "Does she know why you married quickly?" Sophia asked. "She knows enough." He glanced up. "She'll have questions she won't ask. That's her way." Sophia nodded slowly. "And the hands? The workers on the property?" "About 30 altogether, between the house and the fields. Good people, most of them. They'll watch you to see how you carry yourself, and they'll decide accordingly." Something in his voice shifted, almost imperceptibly. "They're loyal to the property. Some of them have been here longer than I have. Don't underestimate what that means." "I wasn't planning to." He looked at her then, a long, considering look, the kind that felt like it was revising something. Then he went back to his papers. The house appeared in the late afternoon, large, solid, older than it looked at first glance. The kind of building that had been added onto over decades by people who cared more about function than appearance. Sophia took it in without comment. It was not beautiful in any simple way, but it had the quality of something that had stayed standing through a great deal, and she found she respected that more than beauty. Mrs. Galt was at the door before the carriage stopped. She was a compact woman, 60s, Sophia judged, with iron-gray hair and eyes that went straight to business without wasting time on pleasantries. She looked at Sophia the way Sophia had expected, measuring, assessing, forming exactly the opinion Robert had warned about. Sophia met her eyes and held them and said, "Mrs. Galt, I've heard you've been managing this house well on your own. I don't intend to disrupt what works. But I will need to understand how everything runs before I can be useful, and I learn faster when people are direct with me than when they're tactful." A pause. Something shifted fractionally in Mrs. Galt's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the particular adjustment of someone who had been braced for one kind of person and found another. "I'll have supper ready within the hour," Mrs. Galt said. "I'll show you the accounts in the morning." "That'll do fine," Sophia said. She felt Robert's attention on the side of her face, but she didn't look at him. They ate supper across from each other at a table large enough to seat 12, The food was good, plain and honest in the way of a well-run household. They talked about the property lines, about the disputed section along the river where Cole had been making inquiries, about the harvest schedule and what it meant for the estate's income through the autumn. It was the most businesslike meal Sophia had ever sat through, and she found she was completely at ease with it. It was when the plates had been cleared and the lamp burned lower that Robert said, without particular preamble, "Cole sent a rider yesterday." Sophia looked up. "I received word just before I left the Alcott house," he said. "He's requesting a meeting, within the month." His voice was steady, but she'd been paying attention for long enough now to hear the thing underneath the steadiness. "He'll have heard about the marriage by now. The question is whether he's requesting the meeting to reconsider his position or to test whether it's real." "And which do you think it is?" "I think Preston Graves is smarter than Cole and has probably told him the marriage changes the calculation. And I think Cole is proud enough that he wants to look at you himself before he decides to believe it." "Then let him," Sophia said. "Invite him here." Robert was quiet. "You're surprised," she said. "A little. You thought I'd want to avoid it." "Most people would." She looked at him steadily. "I've been looked at and judged and found lacking by people who knew me my whole life, Mr. Pinson. One land speculator from Richmond doesn't frighten me." She paused. "But I'd like to know everything about him before he gets here. Every debt, every deal, every pressure point. If he's coming to test whether this marriage is real, I want to be the most real thing he's ever walked into." The lamp flickered between them. Robert Pinson looked at his wife, the woman who had been a stranger to him 8 days ago, and something moved behind his gray eyes that was different from assessment or calculation or even respect. She didn't have a name for it yet, but she felt it. "I'll have the files on Cole sent up from Richmond this week," he said. "Good." She rose to go to her room. Hers was across the hall from his, which was how she'd requested it and how he'd arranged it. No discussion necessary. And she was nearly at the door when he spoke again. "Sophia." Her name in his mouth, for the first time without the miss in front of it. She turned. He was still at the table, both hands flat on the wood, looking at her with that guarded expression that she was beginning to understand was not coldness at all, but the particular caution of a man who'd been burned by trusting easily and had not yet found a reason to stop being careful. "Thank you," he said, "for the terms you set, for being—" He paused, choosing words with the precision of a man who didn't use many of them unnecessarily. "For being what you actually are, instead of something easier." She stood still for a moment. "I don't know how to be anything else," she said simply. She went to her room. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the unfamiliar house settling around her. The tick of the hallway clock, the distant sound of someone moving in the kitchen, the particular breathing of a building she did not yet know but was beginning to learn. She thought about Harrowfield, much further away already than the miles alone accounted for. She thought about Ethan Clark and the feeling of that. How much smaller it was now. How much more like a closed door than a wound. She was not healed. She was not in love. She was not safe in any of the easy, comfortable ways she had once imagined safety would feel. But she was not nothing. She was not the jilted girl in the churchyard anymore, the one people whispered about, the one whose own sister hadn't thought worth a warning. She was Sophia Pinson. She had terms in writing. She had a household that was learning her, and a husband who spoke to her like an equal, and a threat coming from Richmond that she intended to face with her eyes open and her back straight. She had chosen this, with full knowledge of what it was and what it wasn't. She fell asleep to the sound of the Virginia summer pressing against the windows, and she did not dream of anything she'd left behind. The files on Harlan Cole arrived from Richmond on a Friday, 2 weeks after she and Robert had settled into the hard, quiet business of learning how to occupy the same space without getting in each other's way. She'd spent those 2 weeks doing exactly what she'd said she would: learning the household, understanding the accounts, earning Mrs. Galt's cautious professional respect through the simple mechanism of being competent without being combative. She'd also been watching Robert. Not conspicuously. Not the way a suspicious person watches. More the way a careful person does when they're trying to understand something that doesn't fully add up yet. He was always the first one up in the morning and the last to come in from the fields. He ate what was put in front of him without complaint. He was fair with the hands in a way that wasn't performative, simply the natural expression of a man who believed people deserved to be treated decently and acted accordingly without needing to be praised for it. He was also, she noticed, quieter in the evenings than he was during the day. The work focused him. The quieter hours were where whatever he carried came closer to the surface. Not in any way that he showed openly, but in the way his attention went inward sometimes. The way he'd stop mid-sentence and look at the far wall for just a moment before returning to himself. She did not ask about it. Not yet. She filed it away with the same careful patience she applied to everything she was learning here. The Cole files changed things. She spent the better part of Friday afternoon going through them while Robert was in the south field. And by the time he came in before supper, she had 3 pages of notes and a weight sitting low in her chest that hadn't been there when she started. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her notes. He looked at her face. He sat down. "Cole isn't just a land speculator," she said. "He bought out the Harlan family property 3 years ago. The family said they sold willingly, but there are 3 letters in here from the eldest Harlan son saying the terms were coerced. He did the same thing to a widow down in Spotsylvania County 2 years back. And," she tapped the 3rd page, "there's a letter in here between Cole and Preston Graves that mentions you by name. It's dated 4 months after your father died." Robert's jaw tightened. "What does it say?" "It says, and I'm reading this directly," she picked up the page, "Pinson's boy is proud like the old man, but smarter. He'll pay it down if we give him enough rope. Let him think he's in control through the summer. By autumn, we'll have the grounds to move." She set the paper down. "Robert, they were never planning to let you pay it down. They were managing you. They've been waiting for autumn on purpose. And I don't know what changes in autumn, but I think you do." The silence in the room was of a different quality than anything she'd heard in this house before. Robert sat very still. The kind of stillness that is not calm. The kind that's what happens after something hits and the body hasn't caught up yet. "The harvest notes," he said quietly. "If the autumn harvest comes in short, which they'd know it might because the eastern field has been underperforming for 2 years, the mortgage terms allow them to demand an audit of the estate's total operating capital. Not just the loan. Everything." His voice had gone flat. "They'd tie us up in legal proceedings through the winter. Long enough to force a sale at their terms." "But," Sophia said carefully. He looked at her. "The marriage changes the audit trigger. A co-owned estate under joint deed requires both parties' consent for any external audit proceeding." She had read this 3 times to be certain. "I checked the Virginia statutes last week. Cole can't initiate an audit without both signatures, and I have no obligation to provide mine." The room was very quiet. Robert looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that was different from every other way he'd looked at her since the churchyard. Something cracked slightly in the controlled surface of him. Not breaking, more like light getting through. "You read the Virginia statutes," he said. You told me everything before I married you, she said. I thought I should understand what I was actually part of. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she let him have it, the way she'd let her father have the porch in the dark hours. Some things needed a moment before they could be spoken to. When he turned back around, the guardedness was still there, but something behind it had shifted, like a door that had always been shut had been not opened, but perhaps unlocked from the inside. Sophia, he said. Yes, I need you to understand something. He came back to the table and stood with both hands braced against it, looking at her with the gray eyes she had learned by now were not cold at all, just deeply, carefully, self-protectively honest. When I came to your door in Harrowfield, I told you I had practical reasons for this marriage. And that was true. But it was not the whole truth. She waited. My sister leaving didn't just cost me a housekeeper, he said. Eleanor was the only person in this house who knew when I was wrong, who told me. He stopped, started again. After she left, I told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need that the property and the work were enough, and everything else was a luxury I'd spent too much time wanting. He looked at her steadily. And then I stood in the back of that church and watched you put down your flowers, and I thought, that is a woman who tells the truth, even when it costs her, even when the truth is that she's been left. Sophia sat very still. I did not marry you only for the land, he said. I want you to know that. The lamp between them burned steady and slow. The house settled around them. Outside, the Virginia summer was still pressing against the windows, the same as it always had, indifferent to the weight of what was happening inside. Sophia looked at Robert Pinson, this guarded, precise, difficult man who had come to her in the dust of the worst morning of her life and told her the true thing without dressing it up. And she let herself, for the first time, feel the full, complicated reality of where she had landed. Not love. She was honest enough to know it wasn't that yet. But something real, something that had been built, quietly, out of truth and terms, and two people trying very hard to be exactly what they'd said they were. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, more than most people ever got. I know, she said simply, and she meant it. Harlan Cole arrived on a Tuesday. He sent no advance warning, just a rider at 7 a.m, with a card that said he'd be at the Pinson gate by noon and expected the courtesy of an introduction to the new Mrs. Pinson. The phrasing was precise in the way that certain kinds of rudeness always are, dressed up in the language of civility, so that objecting to it made you look like the unreasonable one. Sophia read the card twice, set it on the breakfast table, and poured herself another cup of coffee. He's testing the timing, she said. 5 hours' notice. He wants to see whether we scramble. Robert was already standing, jaw set, the particular stillness she now recognized as controlled anger. I can send word that we're not available. No. She looked up at him. We receive him, calmly, on our terms. She set down her cup. But I want Mrs. Galt to serve the good china, and I want you to let me do most of the talking. Robert looked at her for a moment. You're sure? I've been reading those files for 2 weeks, she said. I know more about Harlan Cole's business practices than he thinks any woman in Virginia is capable of knowing. That's an advantage I intend to use exactly once, and today is the day. He was quiet for a beat. Then, all right. Good. She rose from the table. Wear the dark coat. He almost smiled. She was already on her way to find Mrs. Galt. Cole was not what she'd expected, which she suspected was intentional on his part. He was pleasant-looking, early 50s, well-dressed, with the easy, practiced warmth of a man who had learned that being underestimated required active maintenance. He came with Preston Graves, who was quieter and sharper-eyed, and who Sophia clocked immediately as the more dangerous of the two. She met them in the front parlor. Robert stood beside her, not in front of her, not behind her, but beside her, which she had not asked for, but noted. Mrs. Pinson. Cole took her hand with the particular smoothness of a man who has shaken a great many hands. What a pleasure. I do apologize for the short notice. I found myself with an unexpected window of travel and thought it would be poor manners not to call. Not at all, Sophia said. We're glad of the company. Please, sit down. They sat. Mrs. Galt appeared with the good china, precisely as instructed, and left without being asked. Sophia poured. She took her time with it, not nervously, but with the calm deliberateness of a woman who understood that the manner in which you poured tea told a room something about who held the authority in it. Cole watched her do it. She felt his assessment and met it with a pleasant expression and said nothing until everyone had a cup. I understand you've been managing the estate with considerable skill, Mr. Pinson, Cole said, addressing Robert. Remarkable, given the circumstances of the past year. My husband has always been capable, Sophia said, before Robert could respond. She said it warmly, without edge, as though she were simply agreeing with a compliment. But then, capable men tend to make capable choices. She smiled at Cole. In business and otherwise. A small pause. Graves' eyes moved to her and stayed there. Indeed, Cole said. He reset smoothly. She could see him doing it, shifting his approach the way a man does when the room isn't laid out the way he'd mapped it. I wanted to take the opportunity to discuss, informally, the matter of the remaining loan balance. As a courtesy, given the, recent changes to the estate structure. Of course, Sophia said. Though I wonder if you might clarify something for me first. I've been reviewing the original loan documentation. My husband shared everything with me before we married, which I found very thorough of him. And I noticed the terms include a clause regarding harvest year audit rights. She kept her voice conversational, as though she were discussing the weather. I want to be certain I understand the timeline correctly. The clause activates on the first day of October, doesn't it? If the estate's operating capital falls below a certain threshold at that point. Cole's cup stopped halfway to his mouth. Graves went very still. You've been reviewing the documentation, Cole said. I find it useful to understand what I've signed my name to, she said pleasantly. As co-owner, naturally. The word co-owner landed in the room with the exact weight she'd intended. She watched Cole process it. The implication, then the complication, then the legal reality of it that he clearly had not fully calculated when he'd received word of the marriage. Of course, he said. His voice had shifted very slightly. Still pleasant, but the ease was different now, performed rather than natural. And as co-owner, you'll be aware that the terms of the loan remain unchanged by the change of estate structure. The loan terms, yes, Sophia agreed. Though, as I understand Virginia property law, the audit trigger requires the written consent of all legal co-owners of the estate before proceedings can be initiated. She tilted her head slightly. I spoke with a solicitor in Richmond last week, just to be thorough. The silence that followed was not long, but it was the kind of silence that does a great deal of work in a short time. Graves leaned forward very slightly. You consulted a solicitor? I did. She looked at him directly. The first time she'd addressed him specifically, which she'd also timed deliberately. You must be Mr. Graves. I've heard a good deal about you. Have you? The Harlan family speaks well of you, she said. No, I'm sorry. I believe I have that backwards. The color that moved into Graves's face was not anger exactly. It was the specific discomfort of a man who has just understood that someone knows something he believed was buried. Cole set down his teacup. The pleasantness was still there on his face, but it had gone thin, the way a coat goes thin at the elbows when it's been worn too long. "Mrs. Pinson," he said, "I came today in a spirit of goodwill. I think it would be a shame to—" "Mr. Cole." Her voice stayed warm. Her back stayed straight. "I think it would be a shame, too. I think it would be a shame for the details of the Harlan transaction to become part of the public record in a Virginia court proceeding. I think it would be a shame for the letter you wrote to Mr. Graves in January of this year, the one that mentioned my husband by name and discussed the specific timing of your intended legal action, to be entered as evidence of predatory intent." She paused. "I think the most sensible thing for everyone, yourself included, would be to establish a clean repayment schedule for the remaining balance and close out this arrangement without any further creativity." The room was absolutely still. Robert had not said a word since Cole sat down. She could feel the quality of his attention, the focused, steady, almost disbelieving attention of a man watching something he had not fully anticipated happen in real time. Cole looked at her for a long moment. She met it without blinking. Then he looked at Robert. "You married a formidable woman, Pinson." "I know it," Robert said quietly. Cole picked up his hat. Graves followed a half-beat behind, which told her everything she needed to know about whose instinct had driven the operation. Cole was the name. Graves was the engine. "We'll be in touch regarding the repayment schedule," Cole said at the door. "We'll look forward to it," Sophia said. She walked them out herself, stood on the porch and watched the carriage pull away, and kept her spine straight and her expression neutral until it rounded the bend in the drive and disappeared from sight. Then she sat down on the porch step, pressed both palms to her knees, and let out a breath that had been waiting a long time to be released. Robert came out behind her. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stood beside her the way he'd stood at the churchyard, present, unhurried, not crowding the moment. "You said you knew about the letter," he said eventually. "I did. You didn't tell me." "I needed to see his face when it came up in the room," she said. "If I'd told you, you'd have been watching for his reaction. I needed to be the one watching." A pause. "That's a very cold way to think about something." "Yes," she agreed. Another pause. "I mean that as a compliment." She looked up at him. He was looking out at the drive with that expression she'd come to know. The controlled exterior, and the thing working behind it that he hadn't yet decided to show. "It's not over," she said. "He'll talk to a solicitor of his own, and he'll find out whether I was bluffing about the audit consent clause." "Were you?" "No, but the solicitor I spoke to in Richmond said it would be a near thing. The clause language is ambiguous enough that a good legal argument could go either way." She looked down at her hands. "We need that balance paid before October." "I know." He came and sat beside her, not on the step, but on the edge of the porch, close enough that she was aware of him in the particular way she'd been increasingly aware of him over the past weeks, and had been consistently declining to examine. "How much do you know about the East Field?" She turned to look at him. "The underperforming harvest section," he said. "What do you know about it?" "Only what I've read in the accounts. I want to show you something." He rose. "Come with me." She came. They walked the Eastfield boundary for the better part of an hour. He talked, not in the way he talked over supper, practically and efficiently, but differently. He talked about his father's decisions and his own reversals of them, about the soil and what it needed and what it had been denied. He talked about the men who worked the field and what they'd told him and what he'd been doing about it, slowly, over months, without enough capital to move as fast as he needed. She asked questions, real ones, not polite ones. He answered them without condescension, which she noticed and appreciated. And somewhere between the east field and the walk back to the house, in the heavy late afternoon heat, with the Virginia summer pressing down on both of them, something shifted between them that she couldn't have named precisely, but felt with absolute clarity. It had been happening gradually, she understood, the way a tide comes in, not in a single dramatic wave, but in the slow, patient accumulation of all the small moments that don't announce themselves while they're happening. Every supper conversation, every morning she'd come downstairs and found him already at the table with coffee waiting. Every evening he stopped by the study door and said her name with that specific quietness that meant he had something to tell her and had decided she was the person he wanted to tell it to. She had been careful not to lean into it. She had her terms. She had the 6 months. She had the clean, protected logic of a woman who had been burned once by wanting something before she understood what it was. But the Eastfield, and the way he'd talked about it, not like a businessman explaining an asset, but like a man showing her something he cared about. That was harder to step back from. They were nearly to the house when a rider came through the gate, fast, dusty, the kind of pace that meant news rather than routine. Robert went still beside her. The rider pulled up and came down with a letter already extended, addressed to Sophia, not to Robert. The handwriting on the outside was her mother's. She opened it right there. Her mother's letters were always tidy, careful, evenly spaced. This one was not. The lines slanted. The pen had pressed too hard. "Victoria is gone," it began. "She and Ethan have left Harrowfield entirely. Moved to Richmond, we're told, without settling several accounts in town. Your father is managing, but people are talking, Sophia. The name Matthews is being attached to things that are not our doing. There is a man, a Mr. Foster, a creditor, who came to the house last week asking after us, by connection to Victoria and Ethan's debts. He was not polite. I did not want to worry you, but I think you ought to know." Sophia read the letter twice. She was aware of Robert beside her, aware that he was watching her face and reading what was there without asking for it. "Sophia," his voice was quiet. She folded the letter. She kept her face still through the same sheer practice that had carried her through the church doorway, through Cole's parlor visit, through every moment since the summer that had required her to be more than she felt. "My sister," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "She and Ethan, they've left debts in Harrowfield. A creditor came to my parents." She felt him take that in. "How bad?" he said. "I don't know yet." She pressed the letter flat against her palm. "But my father is a proud man. He won't ask for help easily." "Write him tonight," Robert said. "Tell him—" "I'll write him tonight," she said. "But I want to be clear. This is my family's problem. I'm not asking you to—" "Sophia." He said it the way he'd been saying her name lately, quietly and with a directness that had nothing performative in it. "You sat in my parlor today and handled a man who has been trying to take this property for 2 years. You read Virginia statutes in your own time to protect something that had your name on it for 3 weeks." He paused. "Your family has your name on it a great deal longer than that. Stop drawing a line between your business and mine." She turned and looked at him fully. He was standing the way he always stood, straight, unhurried, with that guarded expression she had long since learned to read the interior of. What was behind it now was not calculation or strategy. It was just him, exactly as he was. She felt something loosen in her chest that she had not even realized was held tight. "All right," she said, quietly. "All right," he said. She wrote the letter that evening, at the desk in the study, while Robert sat across the room going over harvest figures. She wrote her father with the particular steadiness of a woman who had found solid ground under her feet again and intended to use it. told him that she and Robert would look into the situation with Foster, that he was not to be intimidated, that the Matthews name was not for sale, regardless of what Victoria and Ethan had done with their portion of it. She sealed it and looked up. Robert was watching her from across the room. He'd set down his papers. "Done?" he said. "Done." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I owe you something." She raised an eyebrow. "I told you, the night we read the coal files, that I didn't marry you only for the land." He said it evenly, but with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been working up to something and intended to say it right. "I want to add to that." She waited. "Eleanor leaving. I told you it cost me more than a housekeeper. What I didn't say is that after she left, I stopped. I stopped letting myself want things that weren't practical, that weren't things I could protect." His voice stayed level, but there was something rough at the edge of it, the way rough terrain shows beneath a surface that looks flat from a distance. "I told myself a marriage of convenience was what I was suited to, that whatever I'd been before she left, before my father, before all of it, that man was a liability I couldn't afford anymore." Sophia was very still. "And then I stood in the back of a church in Harrowfield," he said, "and watched you put down your flowers, and I thought, that is the bravest thing I have ever seen anyone do. And I thought, I would very much like to know what else that woman is capable of." The lamp burned between them. The house breathed around them. Outside, the summer night pressed against every window, heavy and warm, and entirely indifferent to the fact that something was happening inside that neither of them had fully prepared for. "Robert," she said. "Yes?" "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly." "I always answer you honestly." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking." She met his eyes, steady, deliberate, the way she'd met Cole's eyes across the parlor table, except that this was not strategy. It was just her, being exactly who she was. "Is this still a business arrangement?" The silence stretched for exactly 4 seconds. She counted. "No," he said. "I don't believe it is." She nodded slowly. "Good." She did not go to him, and he did not come to her. That was all right. They were people who had learned to take things at their right pace, and what was between them had been building at exactly the pace it needed to build, and they both understood that. But when she rose and said goodnight and walked to the door, he said her name once more, and she turned, and he was still sitting there with his hands flat on the desk, and something open in his expression that she hadn't seen there before. Something unlocked. "The East Field," he said. "I want to show you the plans I have for it, for the spring planting." She paused in the doorway. "Tomorrow?" "Tomorrow." "Then I'll look forward to it," she said. She went to her room. She lay down in the dark and pressed her hand against her own chest and felt her heart, steady, solid, beating with a patient certainty of something that knew where it was going, even before she'd finished mapping the road. She had come to this house with terms in writing and a locked door, and the careful self-protection of a woman who had learned the hard way what trusting carelessly cost. She was still that woman. She would always be that woman. But she was also, she understood now, something more. She was Sophia Pinson, in a house that had come to know the sound of her step. She was the woman who had read Virginia statutes on her own time and looked Harlan Cole in the eye and made him understand, without raising her voice once, that the easy target he'd mapped had not in fact been available for the taking. She was the woman Robert Pinson had looked at across a grieving churchyard and decided was worth choosing. And tomorrow, he was going to show her his plans for the spring. That was enough. That was, in the quiet of this Virginia summer night, everything. The East Field plans were better than she'd expected. Robert had spread them across the kitchen table the next morning, hand-drawn, precise, with margin notes in his tight, unhurried script, and Sophia had leaned over them with her coffee and asked questions for the better part of an hour. Real questions. The kind that required him to defend his reasoning, which he did without defensiveness, and to acknowledge two places where her thinking improved on his, which he did without hesitation. Mrs. Galt had come in halfway through, taken one look at the two of them bent over the same set of papers, and gone back to the kitchen without saying a word. But Sophia had seen the look on her face. Something that had been withheld for weeks had quietly shifted. That was the morning everything started moving differently. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories where a single moment cracks the world open and rearranges everything in an hour. More the way a river changes course, gradually, with a patient force of water that has simply found the path it was always going to take. Robert began talking to her differently, not more. He had never been a man who used words carelessly, but with less of the deliberate caution she'd first encountered, the caution of a man checking every sentence before he let it out. He started telling her things without waiting to be asked. About the property, about his father, about the men who worked the land and what he owed them, and how he thought about that obligation. She started doing the same. It surprised her the first time she heard herself doing it. Standing at the study door one evening, saying something about her mother, something small and private that she'd have kept to herself 2 weeks ago, and watching him look up from his work and simply listen with his whole attention. No advice, no attempt to fix it. Just the clean, rare gift of someone who understood that sometimes being heard was the thing, and the only thing. She wrote to her parents every week, as she'd promised. Her father's letters came back measured and careful, the way his letters always were. Her father was a man who said important things in short sentences, which meant she had learned over a lifetime to read the space between them. He did not say he was struggling. He did not say the creditor Foster had been back. But she could hear both things clearly in what he didn't write. And she told Robert. And Robert sent his own letter to a solicitor in Richmond without discussion or delay or any suggestion that he needed to be thanked for it. She thanked him anyway. He said, "You'd do the same," and went back to his papers. She stood in the doorway and understood that he was right. That was perhaps the strangest and most grounding thing about being in this house, in this life she had built from the wreckage of a different one. The steady, accumulating realization that she and Robert Pinson were, at the most fundamental level, the same kind of person. Different in almost every surface way, identical in the ways that mattered. She had not expected that. She had expected practical. She had expected tolerable. She had not expected to feel, 6 weeks into a marriage of convenience, like she had found the only person in Virginia who spoke her exact language without either of them having to translate. August arrived, and the heat deepened, and Cole's solicitor sent a letter that was careful and formal and notably less aggressive than the energy Cole had brought to the parlor meeting. Robert read it and handed it to Sophia without comment. She read it and said, "He's retreating to a defensible position." Which means he's talked to someone who confirmed the audit clause. Which means he knows we know, she said. The question is whether he has another angle. He always has another angle. Then we need to be faster than the angle. She set the letter down. How much of the balance is left? 11,000. And the summer harvest? Better than projected. I made some changes to the eastern rotation based on... He paused. Based on what you suggested, in June. She looked at him. He said it plainly, without making a performance of the acknowledgement, which was exactly how he did everything. If the autumn harvest comes in at the rate this summer suggests, she said, can we clear the balance before October? He was quiet for a moment. Doing the arithmetic, she could see him running. If we pull forward 2 payments, and if Graves doesn't find a reason to dispute the figures, then we pay it in person, she said, in Richmond, in front of witnesses. He looked at her. Cole's entire strategy depends on controlling the conditions, she said. The timing, the paperwork, the room. We take that from him. We show up, we pay the final balance in full, and we do it publicly enough that there is no ambiguity about what has happened. She met his eyes. He can't accelerate a loan that no longer exists. Robert was quiet for a long moment. You want to go to Richmond, he said. I want to finish this, she said. He nodded once, slowly, with the expression she had come to love, the one where he was assessing something and concluding it was better than he'd expected. September, he said. We go in September. September, she thought. A month away. 6 weeks, perhaps. She nodded. September. What she had not said, and what she understood with perfect clarity as she turned back to the letter, was that September would also mark exactly the end of the 6-month arrangement they had written in the judge's parlor on a Thursday evening in July. The terms of a cold bargain. The agreement that had seemed, at the time, like the maximum she could ask for, and the most she could reasonably expect. She was not thinking about the terms anymore. She suspected he wasn't either. But she had not said it yet. And she would not say it until she was certain, not of herself, she was already certain of herself, but of whether he was ready to hear it. The letter from Victoria arrived on a Wednesday in mid-August, not from Harrowfield, from Richmond, with a forwarding note from her mother explaining that Victoria had written to the family and asked them to pass it along. Sophia held it for a long time before opening it. Robert was in the south field. She was alone in the study, and she sat with the unopened letter in her lap and made herself breathe before she broke the seal. Victoria's handwriting was the same as it had always been, neat, precise, the handwriting of a woman who had always been more controlled in presentation than in action. Sophia, I know you have no reason to read this. I'm writing because I think I owe you the truth, which I have owed you for much longer than I've been willing to admit. Ethan is not what I believed him to be. I won't give you the details because I don't think you want them, and I don't think I deserve the relief of saying them. What I will say is that I understand now, with a clarity I did not have in July, what I took from you. And I understand that sorry is not a sufficient word for it. I know that. I heard you married Robert Pinson. People in Richmond talk. They say he is a difficult man. I hope they are wrong. You deserve someone who is not wrong for you in the way that Ethan was wrong for you, which means you deserve someone who chooses you on purpose and knows what he's choosing. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not writing to ask for it. I'm writing because I am your sister and because I was wrong, and because even if you never write back, you deserve to hear me say that plainly. Victoria. Sophia read the letter twice. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about the churchyard. She thought about the ivory dress and the flowers she'd set down on the pew, and the sound of the congregation shifting to stare at her. She thought about the particular quality of Victoria's face in that moment, the relief she'd clocked even then, through the shock of everything, and what it meant now that she had more information to put it against. She thought about the fact that Victoria, somewhere in a Richmond lodging house, was apparently living the consequences of what she'd chosen. And she thought about the fact that she, Sophia, was sitting in a study on 4,000 acres with a man who had looked at her across the worst morning of her life and decided she was worth the trouble of choosing on purpose. She folded the letter along its crease. She set it in the desk drawer, not the fire. She was not ready to burn it, and she was not ready to answer it. And both of those things were honest, and she permitted herself the dignity of both of them. Then she heard Robert's boots on the porch, and she closed the drawer, and she went to tell him about September. They arrived in Richmond on the 14th of September. Robert had arranged everything with the precision she'd come to expect from him. The solicitor, the witnesses, the formal setting that made the transaction public in exactly the way that mattered. Cole was not there. He'd sent Graves, which told Sophia that Cole had known how this was going to go, and had decided to preserve himself the humiliation of watching it happen in person. Graves was professional, cold. He received the final payment with the expression of a man who has lost a long game and intends to be seen losing it gracefully, which she respected even as she understood that he would look for another angle somewhere else, with someone else, because men like Graves always did. The solicitor produced the receipt and the release documents, and Sophia signed them beside Robert with the same steady hand she had used to write 8 words on a Thursday evening in July. And when the last signature was done, and the last document was witnessed, and the transaction was closed, the Pinson estate was free and clear of the debt her father-in-law had run up in the last years of his pride. Graves left without ceremony. The solicitor shook Robert's hand, and then, to his credit, shook Sophia's, and said that in 30 years of Virginia property law, he had rarely seen a more cleanly executed resolution to a situation of that complexity. "My wife's reading," Robert said, "is unusually thorough." She looked at him sideways. He was not quite smiling, but he was close to it, which was still the most expression she could reliably expect from him in public, and she had long since decided it was more than enough. They were in the Richmond Hotel that evening, a decent place, the kind Robert chose without fuss when the journey required an overnight. And they were sitting in the small common room off the lobby when he said, without preamble, the way he always said the things that mattered. "The 6 months end this week." Sophia set down her cup. "I know," she said. He looked at her with the gray eyes that she had read every shade of by now, every shift and guarded flicker, and the particular quality they got when he was saying something true that cost him something to say. They had that quality now. "I want to renegotiate the terms," he said. She waited. "The original arrangement was 6 months," he said. "Practical purposes, protection of the property, a shared situation with mutual benefit and no expectation of more than that." He paused. "I want to revise what more than that means." "In what direction?" she said, quietly. "In every direction," he said. "Sophia, He stopped, started again, which she had almost never seen him do. "I am not a man who says things easily. You know that. I think you've known since the churchyard that I'm not built for easy things. I don't come at anything the straightforward way, and I don't open doors that I've closed without good reason. And I have closed a great many doors in the past few years that I know have made me harder to be close to than a person ought to be." She said nothing. She let him find his way to it. "You walked into this house, and you learned it in 3 weeks," he said. "You sat across from Harlan Cole and took him apart with 4 sentences and a knowledge of Virginia statutes. You wrote to your father with the voice of a woman who had found solid ground and intended to give him some of it. You read the Eastfield plans and found the 2 places I'd gotten wrong and told me without apology, which was the right thing to do. And I knew it was the right thing the moment you did it." He stopped. His hands were flat on the table the same way they'd been flat on the kitchen table the morning he'd come to her door in Harrowfield. "And every evening you have walked to the door of that study and said good night. And I have let you go and told myself there was time, and there was patience, and there was the arrangement to consider." "Robert," she said. He went quiet. She looked at him steadily, with the full, clear-eyed directness she had brought to every important moment since the churchyard. the same directness that had put down her flowers and walked out with her head up and written 8 words on a Thursday evening and looked Cole in the eye without blinking once. "I am not going anywhere," she said. "I have not been going anywhere for a long time now. I think you've known that." Something moved across his face. Something unlocked that she had been watching work its way toward the surface for weeks. "I needed to say it," he said. "Out loud. To you." "I know. I love you," he said. Simply, plainly, without decoration, which was the only way he knew how to mean anything. Not the arrangement, not the practical partner, not the woman who reads statutes and handles difficult men. You, Sophia. Whatever you were before Harrowfield, and whatever you are now, and whatever you're going to be, which I suspect is considerably more than either of us has currently mapped. The room was quiet around them. Richmond went on outside the windows, unhurried and indifferent, and she sat across from the man who had come to her in the dust of the worst morning of her life and told her the true thing without asking her to be grateful for it. And she let the full weight of what he'd said settle into her without rushing past it. She had earned the right to feel this completely. She intended to. "I know I am not the easiest man," he said after a moment. "No," she agreed. "I know this was not what you planned for your life." "No," she said again. It was not. She reached across the table and set her hand over his. Deliberate, unhurried, exactly the way she did everything that mattered. "It is considerably better than what I planned." His hand turned under hers, held on. They sat there for a long time. She had not set out from Harrowfield looking for this. She had set out looking for solid ground and a way to stand on it. And that was what she'd asked for, and that was what she'd believed she was getting. She had not expected to find, on the other side of the worst thing that had ever happened to her, a man who understood her in the specific, irreplaceable way that only comes from 2 people deciding to be honest with each other, when the easier thing would have been to keep their distance. She thought about Victoria's letter, about you deserve someone who chooses you on purpose and knows what he's choosing. She had not forgiven her sister yet. She did not know if she would, or when, or in what form. But she understood, sitting in this quiet room with Robert Pinson's hand holding hers, with the careful, deliberate strength of a man who had decided that letting go was no longer something he was willing to do, that Victoria had said the one true thing in a letter full of overdue honesty. He had chosen her on purpose. He had known what he was choosing. And she had chosen him, not in desperation, not in panic, not as the only door left open, but because she had looked at him in the dust of a churchyard and seen a person who told the truth without dressing it up, and had decided that was worth more than anything she was walking away from. They went home to the Pinson estate on the 15th of September, in the last warm days before the Virginia summer finally released its hold on the year. The harvest came in strong, stronger than the accounts had projected, stronger than anything the East Field had yielded in 3 years. Robert told the hands at the end of the first week of harvest that they were looking at the best yield since his grandfather's time. And the sound that came back from that announcement had a quality she felt in her chest. The particular sound of people who had worked hard at something, real, and were being told it had amounted to something. She stood at the edge of the field and listened to it, and felt, for the first time in what seemed like a very long time, simply and completely glad to be exactly where she was. Her father's next letter came with the news that Foster the creditor had withdrawn his claim following the intervention of Robert's solicitor, and that Harrowfield had generally moved on to other gossip, and that her mother was well and missed her and sent her love. There was a postscript in her father's tight, economical hand. "He is a good man, Sophia. I reckon you knew that before I did." She read it twice. She left it on the desk without putting it away. That evening, she went to find Robert in the south field, where he was talking through the last of the harvest figures with two of the hands. And he looked up when she came and said her name with that quietness that meant he was glad to see her. And she thought about the churchyard, and the ivory dress, and the flowers she'd put down on the pew, and how impossibly far away all of it was from where she stood now. She thought about a woman who had walked out of a church with her head up on the worst morning of her life, and had, in doing so, walked directly toward the best one. Sophia Pinson stood in the last light of a Virginia summer and looked at the man who had chosen her on purpose. And she was not broken, and she was not diminished, and she was not the story that Harrowfield had tried to tell about her. She was the woman who had set her own terms, held her own ground, and built something real and lasting from the ruins of everything she'd been told she was supposed to want. And every single piece of it was hers, earned honestly, chosen freely, and no one on this earth was ever going to take it from her again.